Um, I mean, the point is, and therefore it's very good that, when we have questions, pose them directly, as we are now going into very diverse fields. This was on one of the contemporaries of ARP, and now we're going to talk about the next generation. And you're already here, so start.
Good morning. Well, first I would like to thank to Mike Steinkampf for this invitation and to say that I'm very happy to be here with you and have this opportunity to share my thoughts. Well, the trajectory of the Brazilian artist Lygia Clark has been recognized as a lucid process of work started in the late 40s in the field of abstraction towards to a series of therapeutic propositions developed from the 70s. Some of the outstanding narratives about her work, conceived by critics as the Brazilians Mário Pedrosa and Ferreira Goulart, as well as the British critic Guy Brett, and as her own writings describes, a linear process that goes from the pictorial plane to the space, from geometry to organic forms, from the stillness to movement, from a passive gaze to the active participation of the spectator, from rationality to the unconscious, from the art milieu to the real life. The Brazilian contemporary artist Tunga, a close friend of Clark, used it to say that the evolution of her work could be analyzed from the final experiments to the early years, keeping a remarkable coherence. In order to make this clearer, I will retake some few exemplary works of Clark. Lygia Clark initiated her studies in art in late 40s in Rio de Janeiro with the Brazilian painter and landscaper Roberto Buller Marx. From 1950 to 1952, she lived in Paris, where she studied with Fernand Léger, Apatzinis, and the Polish artist Isaac Dobrzyński. These two works that we can see here put in view her early interest in the image of folded superficies suggesting movement, especially the painting composition, since to prefigure her sculptures animals produced a decade later. In 1954, Clark became a founding member of the group Frente in Rio de Janeiro, the first collective, one of the first collective abstract artists in Brazil, along with another artists as Ivan Serpa, Abram Palatnik, Elliot Sica, and so on. They were gathered around the critic Mário Pedrosa, who, on that time, was deeply involved in developing an aesthetic theory based on Gestalt and was one of the most active advocates of abstraction in the country. In the same year, in 1954, Lygia Clark created one of her most important inventions, or discovery, as she preferred to say, when referring to the concept of organic line that was, as she used it to describe, the void space between two juxtaposed planes, drawing a line in between the flat surfaces. So it was a line that was not anymore a graphic line, but a void space, as I told. And from the concept of organic line, she embodied the space into the plane and designed her own process of breaking the frame, which has meant, in this case, as we can see here, it's not mine. The embodiment of the frame as part of the composition. So here we can see that in this square on the ground, on the back, on the ground, that all the lines that we can see here are organic lines. So she was mounting pieces of forms, actually. Next, she developed the series of paintings called Planes in Modulated Surface, clearly inspired in Albers, that consisted in fitting segments of planes juxtaposed. Here, besides the work with the idea of virtual space and movement, the artist gave a real body to the shapes. She was not painting forms anymore, but mounting these shapes. The next step was to fold the plane towards a real space. The series was called Cocoon, in one of her first direct reference to the natural world and at the same time to an inner and subjective reality. Lygia Clark was used to tell that the cocoons had fallen down from the wall to make appear the animals. Her best-known sculptures made with geometric surfaces connected by a flexible spine. These works are conceived as an invitation to the spectator to modify endlessly their foldable geometric shapes. The proposition Caminhando, Walking, made in 1963 with simple paper and scissors, was the decisive step towards the participation of the observer and the inclusion of time in Clark's work. Starting from the Moebius tape, she invited the observer to cut the strip continuously until it's so thin that it was not possible to cut anymore. Besides breaking totally with the idea of the inside and outside in a work of art, the work exists only as a practice of the audience. Walking was also an important step in order to introduce the question of change in Lygia Clark's process, besides making her closer to mutable and organic forms. After the experience of walking, Clark developed the series of flexible sculptures, the inside. The impressive fate the Brazilian artist had reserved for her industrial materials linked her to Arp's negative vision of the modern world, a point of view which played a part in his conception of concrete art. And I will quote him about concrete art. Modern times, with their science and technology, have made man megalomaniac. The atrocious confusion of our epoch is this consequence of this overestimation of reason. From 1964, as we could see here, Clark were more and more far from the objective view of art and of its relation with the world. Thank you. Actually, it's a huge issue. It's very different situations regarding his influence in Brazil or in Venezuela, for instance, when he was part of his works were bought by the country to regarding architectural projects. In Brazil, he was not so shown immediately. We have some tentatives from the Pietro Maria Bardi, that was the former director of Museum of Art of São Paulo, to bring art to Brazil. But the question here for me is that actually what is in the background of my research is that is a revision of the historiography about concrete art in Brazil, and that is used to be read as from the strong split between concrete artists and new concrete artists. And what I think is that these relations are more fluid, because as in the other parts of the world, the separation between abstraction and concrete art is not so fixed, so clear. And I think that it's difficult to talk about his influence in South America without see the examples, the individual examples, as I try to do here. Okay. Okay. Concrete and new concrete. Yes, actually, this is the point for me. The historiography inside Brazil and outside Brazil about the concrete and new concrete art is very focused in this split, used to recognize concrete art with the group of São Paulo, that the Haroldo and Augusto, the poets, was part, and the group of Rio that Ferreira Goulart and Lygia Clark, Elliot Sick, and others was part. The position of the, especially by Augusto and Haroldo, was to deny this split, understanding that the questions with the new concrete artists deal as the breaking of the frame, as the incorporation of real forms as forms in the works, was part of the background and the modern heritage, European heritage, and that it was treated by them in a specific way, but it's not a novelty. You understand? And I think it's clear here. The questions with which Lygia Clark deal, we can see them in the work of Arp, but she leaded with them in a very different way, of course. And this happens because in the 50s, I think that the historiography is too tied to the original debate in the 50s in Brazil, because there were actually many fights between Haroldo and Augusto and Ferreira Goulart, who was based in Rio. But about details and about their own position, what they believe to be concrete art. And the historiography is based on this split, but repeating many times their original arguments. But we feel we can look at this debate in a wider field, comparing with the debates in Europe, the position of art about concrete art. You can see that it's not so, of course, delimited, that we have different views. So what I think it's important to bring is that when we understand the connections between Clark and ARP, or the position of Magnelli in Brazil, we can see that the field was wider, and they are in connection with different groups, with many Parisian abstractionists and the Italian ones. So the exchange was much more richer and dynamic. So because of this, I think that this repetition of the split between concrete and new concrete art, so-called, must be revealed. And this is actually my point in the connection. Okay.
Any more questions, remarks? Yes.
That's maybe just a bit out of the field, but you mentioned the name of Roberto Burle Marx at the beginning of your talk. And like, just very formally, on a formal base of ARP's formal language spoken, I thought of Robert Burle Marx. I mean, the whole beach side of Rio de Janeiro is kind of an ARPian form. Could you say 2-3 words on the reception of Burle Marx of ARP?
I think it's totally related with the interest of, also the interest of Clark in organic forms, of course. And Burle Marx is a great example of an artist, an abstractionist, but a landscaper, and not tied with these labels of concrete or new concrete. And of course, it's very interesting to think about her relation with him and with his do you know his paintings? No, yes, more or less, yes. It's not the best part of his work, I suppose. But anyway, he was very important in this beginning of abstraction in Brazil too. And okay. Mm-hmm.
With the coffee again.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.